I'm Karen Farnsworth of Wildflower Quilting, and this video is about attaching binding with your Longarm. It's a fairly straightforward process, and if you get comfortable with it, you can finish your personal quilts faster, and you might have an additional revenue stream for your Longarm business. You can offer a service of attaching binding to your customers. You can attach the binding to the quilt at the end of the quilting process, so finish all of the quilting and then attach the binding. But the way I like to do it is to attach the binding as I go down the quilt. So my customer will bring me binding ready for their quilt. If I have to prepare the binding, I charge extra for that. Most binding that I work with is going to be 2.5 inch or 2.25 inch strips sewn end to end, and then of course folded in half and pressed ready to attach with the machine. I attach the binding to each section as I go down the quilt. I do that after I have quilted that area. So this quilt is getting an edge to edge across the entire top. So I first set up my edge to edge and quilt the first quilting area. When I'm done with that, and before I roll my quilt and before I use continue, I start attaching my binding. I first make sure that I have enough binding to go around the entire quilt, and then I find the center of my long binding strip, and I'm going to attach my binding starting at the center top of the quilt, moving my way to the edge and then down one side, and then from the center out and down again. Now we'll go to a closer view so you can see me stitching the binding. Now I'm at the top center of my quilt, and I found the center of my binding piece, and I'm going to line up the raw edge of the binding with the edge of my quilt top. Move my quilter into position in regulated mode with channel lock on, and using the back of my hopping foot as my guide, I'm going to start stitching down this binding. First moving from the center right and down, and then from the center left and down. Single stitch to pull up that bobbin, and then we start moving. Now I've stitched from the center all the way to the right and down the right side of my quilt. And I came back to the center, and I'm going to put my hopping foot on my line in regulated mode and turn on that channel lock again. And start from the center and stitch to the left. I use my hands to move the binding to keep it in the right position to make sure it's straight and that it's falling in the right place in relationship to my hopping foot. But if you're more comfortable pinning the binding down beforehand, that's fine too. Once I've stitched to the corner, I need to decide where I'm going to turn the binding down. Now if you have a quilt top that's nice and straight, you're just going to keep that binding on the edge of the quilt top. In my project here, this is actually just kind of a whole cloth, and I need to make my binding come in about 1 inch from the side of where this fabric is. So I'm going to stitch over to about 1/4 inch away from where I want to turn my binding. Stop there, maybe do a few back stitches to secure it, and then move my machine away for a minute. At this point I can turn off the channel lock too. Now just like with a traditional binding, I'm going to flip that binding edge up to make my corner, my miter, and then flip it back down, keeping the edge of that fold even with my binding edge. And then it's going to come straight down the side of that quilt. So now I'll bring my machine back over on top of this. This time I'm going to turn on my 90-degree channel lock. and start stitching down the quilt. Maybe do a little back stitching as well. And I'm just going to use my hands to keep that binding even because my channel lock is on and I know I'm getting a straight line. Now be careful where you stop. You always want to stop attaching the binding before you get to the end of where you've stitched your edge to edge. Don't go all the way down to the belly bar. If you do, your binding is going to be attached to part of your quilt top that hasn't been quilted yet. So I will stitch down just to where my last stitching is, or even just a little bit above it. This is the bottom of where I've stitched. I could go farther to the belly bar, but if I do that, I'm going to be in trouble when I try to stitch my edge to edge after rolling the quilt. So do a little back stitching here, turn off regulated, and now I'm ready to roll my quilt. After I've added the binding to the top section, I roll my quilt, face the sides, and get ready to quilt the edge to edge in this section of the quilt. And to keep my binding out of the way, I just tuck it up near the roller where I know it's not going to get stitched. Do that for the tails on both sides. That just keeps it out of the way while I stitch my edge to edge across the quilt. And then I'm going to use channel lock to stitch my binding down on this section, both sides, and then roll the quilt and repeat the process. Now when I get to the bottom of the quilt, I leave 8 to 10 inches of the binding unstitched because I do like to take the quilt off of my frame and take it to my domestic machine to match those end pieces and stitch the last few inches. You can finish the binding on the machine, but that's not the method that I prefer. Now I'm at the bottom of my quilt and I'm ready to finish attaching the binding. I did all of the quilting on this quilt and then I added the binding all the way around except for maybe about 16 inches worth. Now to attach these two ends of binding, I have a couple of options. If I want to finish the whole process on the long arm, I'm going to take one of these binding ends and fold one of the ends into a triangle point, finger press it a little, and then I'm going to fold the other end into that side of the binding. Now I can just line that up with the edge of my quilt and stitch it down. It does leave a little bit of handwork if you want to close that seam on the binding. The other option I have is to take the quilt off of my frame and finish the binding on my domestic machine. That's usually what I choose to do personally. Now I'm going to show you how I like to finish the bindings. I took the quilt off of the frame, squared it up, and brought it to my domestic machine. Now my Bernina 217, it's not exactly domestic, it's more of an industrial machine, but this is what I sew on. So I'm going to take my two ends of binding, overlap them, and I'm going to trim them so that they're overlapping the same distance as the width of the binding. So my binding strip was cut at 2.5 inches. I'm going to overlap those two ends, make sure my quilt is nice and straight. I'm going to overlap those two ends at 2.5 inches and trim off one of those ends. My machine has this cool measuring tape right here on the table. So I'm going to measure 2.5 and cut that end off. The left side binding gets opened up right side to me and laid flat. The right side binding gets opened up right side to me, laid flat, but then I flip it toward me upside down and then turn it, twist it, to put it at a right angle, right sides together, on my left end binding. Now I stitch from corner to corner, trim off the excess dog ears, and my binding is ready and the perfect length to be stitched onto my quilt. Now I've shown you just a couple of ways you can finish the binding. You use whatever method works for you. I just hope I gave you some ideas. And that's how easy it can be to add binding to your quilt on your long arm. I hope you liked this video. Happy quilting!